River City Weekly is brought to you each week by Jim Clark Motors.
Hi, and welcome to this special edition of River City Weekly. I'm Josh Garber, in this week for Greg Hurd. We're celebrating 100 years of powered flight. When we come back, we'll bring you the story of how this rare aircraft was lost in a tragic training accident in the early days of World War II. Left underwater for 48 years, brought back up, restored, and given a new mission in life. River City Weekly will be right back. Welcome back to River City Weekly. This is a Grumman F4F Wildcat, one of only 2 left in flying condition in the world. Though this particular aircraft never served on the front lines in World War II, the story behind it will nevertheless amaze you. Throughout the next 30 minutes, we'll tell you how this airplane was lost off an aircraft carrier on the Great Lakes, found nearly a half-century later, and restored with a great amount of attention paid to historical accuracy. Ladies and gentlemen, we proudly present to you Raising the Wildcat. This is a Wildcat, the official nickname the Department of the Navy gave to this plane, the Grumman F4F. This particular aircraft rolled off the assembly line at Long Island, New York in February 1943. A product of the Iron Works, the nickname Wildcat pilots gave to Grumman. The nickname is derived from the tough reputation of many of the airplanes produced by the company, for no matter how bad a beating a Grumman airplane took, many of them managed to get their pilots back home alive. Today, out of the more than 7,000 Wildcats produced, barely a dozen remain. Wildcat owner and pilot Steve Craig.
Well, this particular aircraft had been returned from active war status for anti-submarine patrol off the coast of Florida to Glenview Naval Air Station and was being used for advanced pilot transition training and carrier qualifications and gunnery practice.
Navy pilots, or naval aviators as they prefer to be called, would go to the Chicago area base to learn how to land on aircraft carriers. There weren't any aircraft carriers on the Great Lakes at the time, so the Navy had to get a little creative.
The Navy bought 2 lake liners, pleasure boats, and they cleared the whole top off and put a deck on them and made them into carriers.
The 2 lake liners, the USS Wolverine and the USS Sable, were designated only as training carriers, meaning they only had enough room for 1 aircraft to land and take off at a time. Steam catapults found on today's ships also weren't built onto these carriers. To get planes into the air, Mother Nature had to do her part.
Those carriers that were redesigned, cruise boats basically with a flat deck, you had to wait for a windy day. Maybe they had 10, 15 knots of wind at least, and then with their 12, 14 knots that they could maintain, they'd have enough wind over the deck to maintain flight operations.
Provided all the weather conditions were right, new pilots had to locate a carrier and one by one make a few practice approaches on it. Once the landing signal officer, or LSO, on the carrier was satisfied with the pilot's demonstrated skill, he gave them the cut signal. The pilot chopped the power and hopefully caught a cable with a plane's tailhook. It was not an easy thing to do at first, as veteran Wildcat pilot Dean Allen describes for us.
You got a certain narrow strip that you got to set it down in, or you're going to be too long and too short, and either one can be a big problem. So, well, the first time was probably like everybody else's. The last thing I tell you is, when you come in and catch that hook, keep your feet off the brakes. But I didn't. I seen the end of that carrier coming up real quick, and I had no control. I just put the brakes on. I'd caught a wire and it jerked me to stop pretty quick. And they come running out and start taxiing around back the other end so you can take off again.
Those who could not make it the first time around were sent back to the practice field.
We set up a traffic pattern just down there by the city of Chicago, because that's where that Wolverine was birthed at. it'd take out, and as soon as we got there, we'd set up a pattern around it. Usually it was 4 or 5 of us at a time. They'd say, bring your flight in, whatever your call sign was. They'd say, bring your flight in, set up a pattern. Well, we was sitting out there waiting. I heard him 2 or 3 times, the guy on the radio say, so-and-so, number so-and-so, take it on back to the base. You're not ready to qualify. Of course, that made me think, God damn it, when I get up there, I hope I do. Hope I don't goof up like that. I think I had 1 wave off and got the rest of them in there, and they sent me home. I didn't ask them if that was enough. I just said, okay.
Carrier qualifications were a learning experience for young aviators. As such, there were numerous accidents. Causes ranged from pilot error, adverse weather conditions, or mechanical failure. Although not all of them were lost during carrier qualifications, there were dozens of crashes into the lake. It's been estimated that as many as 200 airplanes are now resting on the bottom, most of which were deposited over a 3-year training cycle during the war. This plane was one of them.
On March 1st of 1944, the pilot, John Forsberg, had an engine failure on takeoff from the Wolverine and crashed the plane into Lake Michigan, where it remained at 200 feet for a little over 48 years before it was recovered.
Forsberg survived the accident, and the Navy placed the blame for it squarely on his shoulders. Unfortunately, there was no way of proving engine failure. That is, until it was found at the bottom of the lake in the early 1990s. When we come back, the story of how, after spending almost a half-century in 200 feet of water, this Wildcat was raised from the dead.
Well, the plane apparently was in remarkable condition overall. One of the tires still contained air, and they were able to pump up the other tire.
We'll be right back with Raising the Wildcat. Welcome back to River City Weekly's special presentation of Raising the Wildcat. After this F4F crashed into Lake Michigan after a failed takeoff from the USS Wolverine, the Navy launched an investigation. The pilot on that final flight told investigators there was a mechanical malfunction with the airplane. However, since the aircraft couldn't be recovered at the time, the Navy found sufficient evidence to determine the cause of the aircraft accident to be pilot error. In blaming John Forsberg for the accident and loss of the Wildcat, the official report at the time said Forsberg failed to lock the throttle in the full position. For nearly 48 years, Forsberg carried the burden of blame for the accident until a fateful decision was made, not to reopen the investigation, but to fill a void in aviation history.
Well, it was 1991, and then, as I understand the story, the Naval Aviation Museum contracted with a company to recover aircraft off the bottom of Lake Michigan, and they were surprised when they actually got 4 Wildcats instead of the 2 that they thought they were going to get.
That company, A&T Recovery, based near Chicago, worked with little better than an estimation of where the accident occurred. The recovery team did eventually find the aircraft in 210 feet of icy water. Upon close inspection by a remotely piloted underwater vehicle, the throttle was found locked in its full position, as Forsberg maintained for nearly half a century. The Navy later cleared Forsberg's name. The 1991 recovery effort also resulted in a pleasant surprise for the Navy and, by extension, Wildcat pilots and enthusiasts.
Someone at the Navy made a decision to then exchange 2 Wildcats, 2 surplus to their needs Wildcats, for part of the money that was owed to the company that brought these up off the bottom of Lake Michigan. And that company then, after getting clear title from the Navy, within 24 hours had sold these airplanes to collectors.
From there, the restoration process got underway, which, all things considered, was not as hard as you might think.
Well, the plane apparently was in remarkable condition overall. One of the tires still contained air, and they were able to pump up the other tire. But overall, the aluminum parts of this airplane, and the plane is mostly aluminum, was in remarkable condition. The fuselage is essentially entirely original, and the cockpit, all of the controls, rudder pedals, brakes, part of the brake assembly, the landing gear, all of that is original. The propeller was no good. They had to locate a propeller. The wing had been damaged, the right wing substantially, so they had to rebuild both wings. But from start to finish, they completed the full restoration just a little over 2.5 years.
Throughout the restoration, great care was taken to maintain historical accuracy. And to the veterans that once flew these planes in the war, it looks like that aspect of the project met its goal.
But this plane is just remarkable. It's actually better now than it was when it flew, because it has a better engine, bigger engine, and it has a much better propeller.
Paul Beecham has an interesting history with this particular Wildcat. At Craig's invitation to come see the airplane, Beecham made a surprising discovery.
And it was just by chance that I brought my logbook, because I didn't think. When I checked out on carriers, there were probably 100 of these planes at Great Lakes Naval Air Station. And the odds against me flying this particular plane were 100 to 1. So it was really something when we looked in my logbook and found this serial number and realized that I had flown this particular plane. It could have been this plane, but I remember one flight. It was a very strange weekend for Chicago on January the 28th. It was about 75 degrees. You have a landing signal officer there, you touch your wheels down, he gives you the cut, you hit the ground and you give it throttle. You don't hesitate, you just go on up and around. You keep going around and you may shoot 15, 20, 30 landings. Well, it gets awfully boring for the landing signal officer, and they have a lot of different signals they can give you. And there's one signal that signifies, land, I want to talk to you about something you're doing. Well, out of the corner of my eye, I'll swear I saw he give me this signal. So the next time around, I get my cut and I land, and instead of just going on and taking off, I taxi forward and start to taxi back where he was. Not realizing this was a dirt field, and at 75 degrees, the field had thawed. And I went about 20 feet and the mud collected on my wheels, and I was mired. I couldn't go forward, backwards, or sideways. There wasn't anything for me to do except cut the engine and pull the cockpit, and got out of the plane. And he said, "What the hell are you doing?" You know, and I said, "Well, I'll swear you gave me the land signal." And I think he didn't admit that he did, but I do think he was just practicing. He didn't think I'd see him. That could have been this plane.
Beecham flew the airplane in late January of 1944, barely a month before Forsberg took the aircraft on its final flights.
To sit here and look around inside this plane, we use manifold pressure. And I did this 61 years ago. F4F. And it just looks, and it's amazing. It's amazing.
The Wildcat was largely mechanical. There weren't any hydraulics to help the pilot control the plane. It was all leverage and brute strength, which is exactly what it took to handle the airplane on takeoff.
Okay, you're standing on your brakes for one thing. When you're standing, you're ready to go, and then you let go of your brakes and you give full throttle all the way forward. And when you get about 50, 60 knots, you start getting control of the plane, because of the air going over it, you know. And then this plane probably takes off at 70 or 75. Pull the nose up, still full throttle. You reach down, and if you got your head way down here, to roll up those wheels. And when you're taking off and them up, it's a bit tricky.
Wildcat pilots also had to be very careful when it was time to land. One needs only to look at the Wildcat head-on to see why. The wingspan of the aircraft is 38 feet, wingtip to wingtip. The span of the two main landing wheels is less than 6 feet.
It was wild to control. Great airplane in the air, but once it got on the ground, it was a fight. It was for me anyhow.
While a little wily on the ground, the Wildcat could hold its own in the air. What it didn't have in speed and maneuverability, it more than made up for in durability and protecting the pilot in battle.
The Zeros, if you got a burst in on them, it just blow it completely apart.
We could absorb them in our fuel tanks, and they couldn't. Made a lot of difference. Saved a lot of lives.
We'll be right back with Raising the Wildcat. The Wildcat had been flown for almost 10 years before it was sold to Steve Craig in 2002. And the reason he says he was drawn to it is to preserve the little-known stories of those opening days of the war.
Well, from the very beginning, beginning on December 7th and then beginning the next day, December 8th, the defense of Wake Island, the Wildcat and the pilots and the crews that maintained and flew this airplane in support of the Pacific War is really a remarkable story of sacrifice and heroism. And for example, there were more medals of honor awarded to Wildcat pilots than any other plane in the history of aviation. So it truly is. It truly is a very special artifact, memorial, really.
During the restoration, crews were meticulous in keeping the aircraft just as it appeared in those early days of World War II, as a memorial to the sacrifice of the men who flew this plane into battle. Under the canopy, a special tribute is paid to perhaps one of the greatest known Wildcat pilots of all time, Edward Butch O'Hare.
In his defense of the Lexington, flying a plane identical to this, an F4F-3, when he single-handedly attacked 8 Japanese Betty bombers and shot down 6 of them, was credited for 5.
Paul Beecham, a former pilot of the Wildcat, and its younger brother, the F6F Hellcat, remembers O'Hare's daring mission.
Well, I absolutely heard about Butch O'Hare. Now, at the time that he did this, I was still a cadet at Pensacola. And this was the first big story of the war, so it was really blown up. I mean, it was the first time that we had achieved something against the Japanese. Up until this time, every story was, we had been defeated. And so it was a wonderful news release. And I'm not discounting what he did. He did a great job. He shot down 5 planes in about 30 minutes and maybe saved an attack on the fleet. And he certainly deserved all the credit he got.
When Wildcats first began dueling with the Japanese Zero, the pilots found often their heavy F4Fs just couldn't keep up with the enemy aircraft. So they learned to keep the Zero within their realm.
You could turn with the Zero pretty well until you got above, I'd say 7,000 to 8,000 feet, and you started losing power. Zero operated better higher than we did. They could turn quicker than you could, accelerate quicker than you could, but it wouldn't take much of punishment. You put a couple of 50 caliber shells in the fuel tank, and that was it. The fight was over.
A kill or be killed situation, usually dogfighting was over within just a few minutes. A scant sliver of time compared to the uncertainty surrounding these pilots during war. As Alan explains, disaster could strike any time, and it wasn't always due to the enemy.
One day I was sitting out there at the end of the strip in the Admiralty Islands and looking out over, waiting for a couple of planes to clear the strip. And I was looking right down the runway, and past the runway was the harbor they had a big harbor around the main Isle of Man that's there in the Admiralty. And while I was sitting there looking, all of a sudden this ammunition ship blew up in the harbor.
Alan witnessed the destruction of the Mount Hood. She was loaded with ammunition for other ships that were preparing for the Philippines offensive. 45 sailors died, over 300 were missing, and nearly 400 were wounded. Losing friends is never easy, but as Beecham says, in the air, you're somewhat protected from seeing the actual death of a squadron mate.
In our squadron, we had a squadron of 48. We had 24 pilots shot down. We didn't see anyone get killed. We didn't see them hands blown off, legs blown off, you know, all that sort of stuff. They just didn't come back from the flight. We may see their plane go in the water. We may see it explode in air, but that's still not like seeing somebody, a friend of yours, being riddled with bullets. I'm not saying it was any easier. Well, yes, it was easier. I can't imagine seeing a buddy ripped to shreds by bullets. And it wasn't easy, of course, to lose friends. It hurt terribly because we were a band of brothers. And in times of combat and war like that, you just don't think about it. You've got a job to do and you do it.
There are many distractions in war, but one that was always on the minds of many pilots was the Golden BB, the infamous term they gave the projectile you never saw coming. However, there was a little protection they could take against the unseen.
Keep your head on the swivel, because you'll never see the one that kills you. And it's true. They kept pounding that into you. Keep looking. Keep that head on the swivel all the time. And it's good advice. Probably never had any better.
For Alan and Beecham, the military offered experiences that most of us will never go through. From the tragedy of war to the triumph of flying some truly great airplanes. Alan sums up that chapter of his life in these words.
I've always said I wouldn't take $1 million for what the experience I've had, and I wouldn't do it again for $10 million. So that's about as honest as it can be.
After the war, Alan kept on flying and was actually called back into service for the Korean conflict. Beecham, meanwhile, decided to close the book on his flying career. He went on to run a successful auto dealership here in Lawrence. He now keeps busy in Topeka with his picture frame shop. As for the Wildcat and its owner, Stephen Craig, you can plan on seeing them in air shows around the country. Coming up in our final segment of River City Weekly, we'll give you one last look at the Wildcat. Stay with us. Welcome back to River City Weekly. If you'd like to get in contact with us, we invite you to do so at rcw@sunflower.com. For now, though, we'd like to leave you with a few last looks of this extraordinary aircraft. For River City Weekly, I'm Josh Garber. Thanks for watching.